What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. Today, I want to share a study with you. This is about a beauty attractiveness exchange. What we're talking about here is essentially, do men and women, particularly men, exchange status? Do men exchange income or wealth for beauty, right? The common idea that rich men, often old rich men, seek younger, more beautiful women. So here's a study on this. I think it's a very well-designed study. This is by McClintock. It was conducted in 2014. Title of the study, Beauty and Status, the Illusion of Exchange in Partner Selection. So this is a trope that we see often, right? Hot young women seeking out rich men, often older men. So what do they call them? Like gold diggers, for example. All kinds of different tropes mixed up. Is it that common? Some people probably think that it is. And just to say right off the bat, it's not just this huge dispersion, right? Because it can fall on a range. We have gold diggers, right? Where a beautiful woman seeking a very old man and that sort of thing. But it could be a very small effect as well. So that's what we want to look at. This probably does happen. We see it happen occasionally, but to what extent does this actually happen? To what extent do people, particularly young women, trade beauty for status? And by status, what we're looking at here is socioeconomic status. We're looking at education. We're looking at income. There's a bunch of different metrics which we will mention and go over shortly in the video. So I want to mention first, this is something that happens. It's possible that people overestimate how much this happens. It's possible that it happens very, very rarely, and you'll see if that's the case or not as we get into the study. But salience bias is a cognitive bias that occurs when we focus on things that stand out, right? That are different or unique. It's precisely because they are uncommon. It's precisely because they don't happen very often that they stick out so much. So what is an example of that? A terrorist attack, right? Shark attack, lightning strike. These kind of things that stick out, that are uncommon. And is it the case that we see very large beauty status exchanges? Does that happen very often? Well, we'll see the results of the study, but go into this kind of thinking about that. Do you see a lot of very mixed, beautiful couples on the street, or are they mostly people who seem to be in the same level of attractiveness, in the same social class, and so on? Looking at some main concepts here before we go into the study. Assortative mating versus beauty status exchange. This is kind of a paradox, right? Because assortative mating refers to the selection of partners who are similar. And this is probably one of the most well-observed effects in the psychology of mate selection, of relationships, is that people consistently select partners who are similar to them. Similar in which ways? In all of the ways, guys. Every way, basically. They select partners who have similar personality traits, regardless of the personality measure, to more or less extent, depending. They select partners who have similar levels of income, similar levels of education, and of course the big one, people select partners who have a similar level of attractiveness. But at the same time, we also see this idea of exchange, right? The idea of exchange for beauty, and that would indicate that people are not selecting assortatively, that people are selecting in a directional way, right? Again, normally we see this as beautiful women, rich men. It can be reversed, but it usually isn't. That's typically what we see when we do see it. Typically, that is the stereotype. So it's important to understand right off the bat that it's not necessarily that one is wrong and the other is right. One can occur much more, and one can still occur less frequently. So they're not mutually exclusive. We want to look at what is more prevalent, specifically how prevalent is this? Is this something that we can measure and say this is the magnitude of the exchange? This is about how much people exchange, right? Do people exchange just a little bit of beauty for a lot of wealth, or that sort of thing? Does it take a lot of money to get a really beautiful woman? And so on. And how often does this even happen in the population at all? So it's kind of what we're going to be looking at here going forward. So as I mentioned in the past slide, and looking at this one, assortative mating, matching, why? A quotation from the author here. Assortative mating, it's the strongest force in partner selection. As I mentioned, it's probably one of the most well-researched observations in mate selection, in this psychology of relationships and that sort of thing. So we see, as I mentioned, very strong assortment for physical attractiveness, very strong assortment for socioeconomic status. And there's three reasons for this, three potential reasons. I'm sure there's more, but here's the three big ones that tend to be used to explain this in the research. One is homophily, right? And what does that mean? It means an actual preference for similar mates. Because it's possible that we select other mates, but we don't have an actual preference for other mates. Some research that supports this indicates that we select mates who are similar to us without knowing it, right? So it's independent of what our actual preference is. If you look at research on attractiveness, for example, on dating studies and that sort of thing, people shoot for mates that are higher. They don't deliberately go out and say, I need someone who is a 5 because I'm a 5. But they end up with 5 anyway. But when people don't have that conscious input, for example, we select people who are not too genetically distinct from us, but who are also not too genetically similar. So we see a modative form of assortment for genetic similarity. And that's not a preference that people has consciously, you know. No one goes into mate selection thinking, I need to find someone who is genetically similar to me, but not too much and not too genetically different either. So that's a form of selection that would be totally unconscious. We are attracted to those kind of people who are kind of similar to us, probably without being aware that we are. Another good example from the research of this is how people are attracted to mates that actually look like their parents a little bit, right? There is inter-rater correlation in the similarity of faces between boyfriends and the fathers of women, right? Women select boyfriends who kind of look like their own parents. Could be due to a similarity effect, which has been researched a lot in psychology. And a quick digression, some new research on that mere exposure and similarity effect is bringing that into question as well. But that could be one reason for it, okay? So the second reason here, third-party pressure, what does that mean? The entire environment, basically, right? The entire structure of the environment. This could be everything from an arranged marriage, where your parents are picking a mate that is suited for you, or it could just be, I went into this kind of environment and this kind of school, and that's basically what the environment presented me with. This is who my friend said was a good mate. This is who my friend said was a bad mate. That sort of a thing. And the third one would be a lack of contact with outgroups, which is kind of related to the second point here, right? At least up until online dating. And online dating, again, this is a big game changer. We're seeing people were very limited into who they had contact with. And if you don't have contact with someone, you can't select them as a mate, right? So your mates would be limited to your friends groups of friends, your work, your school, your hobbies, probably in your immediate geographical location. Now we see that circle has expanded a lot with online dating, right? You can have access to the entire city, but you're still kind of limited, at least by geography, right? You can't match with someone in Egypt if you don't live in Egypt. If you live in New York City, it's going to be people in New York City. So you still kind of have that in-group selection and that lack of contact with out-group. So 3 big reasons, and I'm sure there's many more, but 3 big ones for why we see such strong assortative or matching mating. Another concept here related to that we can look at, this is the idea of consensually ranked traits. A consensually ranked trait refers to the preference for one trait over the other, right? So when we see assortative mating, for example, for religion, this is because people deliberately select people of their own religion. People don't have typically a hierarchy of religions in their mind. Everyone likes their own religion. If you're Jewish, maybe you select for a Jewish person. If you're Muslim, maybe you select for a Muslim person. If you are Christian, maybe you select for a Christian person, and so on. And probably if you have a hierarchy of those in your mind, it's probably whatever your religion is that comes first. But most people do have consensually ranked traits in other ways. And of course, the big one again here would be physical attractiveness, right? So people do prefer more attractive individuals. People shoot for individuals that are higher than them. They don't look for, as they would with their own religion, right? They don't say, I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I would like to find a mate who is an Orthodox Christian. They don't say, I'm a 7, so I would like to find a mate who is a 7. I want the most attractive person that will have me, basically, is how people think. So there's something called the market matching hypothesis, and this is kind of self-explanatory in the title because it's basically the idea of a dating market. I think it's an intuitive concept now because it has become so popular, that concept, just in the mainstream. but it may explain how we get assortative mating for traits that are consensually ranked, right? And the explanation for that is probably that people who are more desirable are able to win over other people who are more desirable. And that also means that people could exchange one desirable trait for another. And that's where we get to the beauty status exchange versus matching, right? Because if people can trade one desirable trait for another, that means a rich man can trade his desirable trait, which is being rich, for a beautiful woman whose desirable trait is being beautiful, right? And at the same time, this can also explain matching. It doesn't have to explain just that status exchange, because people can share the same desirable traits, two beautiful people, right? And that's what they are exchanging. That's why they're picking each other, and that is why they're excluding less desirable mates. What we also see is the co-occurrence of undesirable traits. And what this refers to is the within individual correlation of things like beauty and status and other traits. Many traits that are attractive, many traits that are unattractive are not entirely independent from one another, right? That means there is a relationship between physical attractiveness and some other traits that may be personality traits, maybe behavioral traits, maybe social kind of traits like status. And so ones that we see pretty consistently, physical attractiveness predicts higher income, right? People that are more attractive have a little bit higher incomes on average. They have a little bit higher grades on average. Typically, if you look at different status measures, they typically have higher status on average. We see that with height as well, for example. You know, taller people make more on average. They're more likely to be the CEOs of companies and that sort of thing. This may have been something that most of you have heard of at some point. So this can actually create the illusion of a beauty status exchange, even when there is none, even when the selection is assortative, right? Because when people have both of these traits, when they are related, if two people who match in attractiveness also correlate with those other traits, you can look and you can say, he's a rich man, she's a beautiful woman, discounting perhaps that he is also an attractive man, equally attractive or very close. So a lot of past research looking into this question didn't control for that at all. And that's a big criticism by this author in this research. She mentions many of these past studies. For more details, read the paper about that, or it'll be too long to go into in the video. But she's kind of critical of the past research. They look at small groups of couples. They have small sample sizes. A lot of them measure preference versus actual mate selection, as I mentioned. So mate selection, right? Different from preference. If you go on to Tinder and you look at these Tinder studies, kind of as I mentioned in the past slide, people will indicate a preference for the most attractive people. That doesn't mean that they're getting the most attractive people in real life, right? It doesn't mean that they are actually meeting them and matching up with them and so on. It's important to look at actual mate selection over indications of preference, depending on, on what you're looking at. If you're looking at something like actual mating, like we are here, then of course that's going to be the better measure. So the current study actually controls for this. It accounts for this by controlling for the relationship within individual correlations between personality traits, income, education, and physical attractiveness. We can move on now, going into the methodology section here. This is from a nationally representative longitudinal data set. The data came from 2001 and 2002 is when this began. It's a longitudinal data set, so it came in many waves, but that would have been when it began. Pretty large sample. They're looking at 500 dating couples, 500 cohabiting, or couples that live together, 500 married couples. So 1,500 couples total, 3,000 participants total. Large sample, nationally representative sample. So this is something that you can probably count on being able to generalize to population demographics in the United States as a whole. They looked at different physical traits, right? Physical attractiveness traits. They looked at a few different physical attractiveness traits and actually compressed this into, I think, 2 different physical attractiveness scales. So, facial attractiveness, ratings of attractiveness on a typical Likert scale, 1 through 7, very attractive, a little bit attractive. You know how that goes. They looked at personality attractiveness measures. They looked at measures like grooming, which they condensed into that attractiveness. They looked at health, which was self-rated, so the people basically said, I'm healthy, So they looked at BMI, which was not self-rated, which was actually measured. They looked at years of education, right? So years of education would be a proxy for school, right? You know, you finish 12 years of education, you finish high school, you finish 16 years, you have a bachelor's degree and that sort of thing. And then they looked at the Duncan Socioeconomic Index, which is an index intended to measure class, right? And this is going to be a big measure of income as well. Income is a feature on this. Understanding the background, understanding how the study is conducted, we can go on now and we can look at the results here. I'm going to go ahead and put the tables from the study up on the screen for you guys instead of the slides for the first, because this has a lot of data, and I'm not going to go over every single point. I'm going to go over the main findings that were reported by the author. These are going to be the largest relationships and the most important ones. I'll mention which things are excluded, and if you guys want to see more, then pause the video and look at the chart and see if there's anything in there that catches your eye. And if there is, and you have questions or you notice a relationship that you think is interesting, well, leave a comment. I would like to hear about it and what you think about that. So putting table 1 up on the screen now, this is descriptive statistics, right? So we see some different relationships here between the variables. Women were more attractive on almost every measure, right? Women scored higher in physical attractiveness. They scored higher in their personality attractiveness measures, scored lower in BMI. Women were more likely to graduate, more likely to have a higher education level, more likely to have a higher socioeconomic status, but they had lower current income and they had a lower projected income going into the future. Most of these were small differences. The only decent difference that was about a standard deviation away in the distributions was forecast income, right? So men are probably going to make more in the future. This is kind of what we've seen before, and I've written about this as well on the website, is that women are typically pretty consistently rated as more attractive. This is something that we see in animals that are sexually dimorphic, right? Sexual dimorphism, when the male and the female of the species does not look exactly the same. A squirrel is not a very sexual dimorphic animal. You look at a squirrel, you can't tell if it's a man or a woman, male or female. You look at a human being, you can instantly tell it is a man or a woman. You look at a lion, you can tell. You look at a gorilla, you can tell. You look at a chimpanzee, you can kind of tell. So when animals are more sexually dimorphic, usually one of them is going to be more attractive. Classic example, often it's the man, the male, I should say, the man animal. The peacock, classic example. Big tail, beautiful, and a lot of birds are like this, where the male bird is much, much more beautiful than the female. In humans, it's probably the other way around. Typically, the woman is considered more beautiful by men and by women in general. So, small digression there. What we see here, something to point out, and this was mentioned in a past slide, is that if women are a little bit more attractive on average, and men have a little bit higher of an income on average, this can also kind of create an illusion of exchange, because it means that most women in their relationships are going to be a little bit more attractive than their partners. They're going to be more attractive overall. I say a little bit, it could be more, but it's going to be an average. On average, they're going to be more attractive than their male partners. On the flip side, most men are going to have more money than their female partners. They're going to have a higher status at work, perhaps. They're going to have a higher salary or an income. And that was the case with education as well until very recently. Something you can see here from the descriptive statistics. Women are now going to university more, right? Women are graduating more as well. They drop out less than men do. So women are completing education more fairly recently. Wasn't always the case, but that seems to be the case now. Moving on to the second part of the results here. This is within individual correlations. Putting table 2 up on the screen for you. Within individual correlations, what does that mean? These are traits within a single individual, right, that correlate. For example, are attractive people more wealthy, right? Does income and attractiveness correlate? Does education level and income correlate? Does education level and personality correlate? All within an individual, within each person in this test. And as you can see from the chart, almost all of the attractiveness and status measures were correlated, right? Higher attractive people, higher status people, higher education individuals, typically more attractive. All of these things kind of cluster together. Worth noting that these are small to medium correlations, right? Nothing hit 0.3, which is where you would typically interpret one of these Spearman's or Pearman's correlations as being a medium-sized correlation. So very consistent correlations. Now, we do see a very, very consistent relationship, but it's not a giant relationship. So don't be disheartened if you are not high status and you think like, oh, this is saying I'm ugly. Not necessarily, and I've mentioned this as well. I've written about this in the past. If you have a correlation that is only about 0.1 or 0.2, you're not going to be able to look at someone if you know that and even know if the things that correlates with will actually occur within that individual beyond chance. So don't lose hope, if you see this and think like, I'm low status, so I'm probably ugly. Maybe not. Maybe you are. I don't know. So let's see what else we see here in the results. Putting table 3 up on. And this is between partner similarity, right? This is where we are looking at how similar the man and the woman partners are to one another. And this is where we begin to see large correlations. You can see them in the chart. Large correlations here being correlations that are over 0.5. And the big ones that we see are expected graduation, right? Which is the projection or estimate that these people will have higher levels of education in the future. Their years of education, actual, right? So people that are actually more educated, that have completed more school. And socioeconomic status. So these are correlations between two partners. So more educated man correlates with more educated woman, right? He's more likely to have a more educated partner. He's more likely to be from the same class, the same socioeconomic background. Some medium correlations here. Physical attractiveness at 0.25 and personal attractiveness at 0.38. So here we're seeing, kind of small, medium to perhaps medium, large across those two variable correlations, right? And so what does that tell us? People that are more physically attractive are more likely to select partners who have the same level of physical attractiveness that they do. Assortative mating. This is where we see, the assortative mating effect appear. Important. You can tell relationships in research in these charts, not just by what is shown, but sometimes by what is not shown, right? And what we see here is there are no negative correlations. What does that mean? It means that this is very strong evidence against the idea of a beauty and status exchange. Because if there were a large beauty and status exchange, if this were something that was common in the couples, I should say, if the effect were, well, really both, if the effect were large, even if it was a small group, or if the effect were small, but it was something that was frequent within the group, you would begin to see a negative correlation. Why? Because you would either have a very strong effect for very ugly and very rich people, or you would have a small effect for lots of people who varied, notably. But there's neither of that. Instead, we really see really consistent correlations across all of that. So kind of strong evidence there against the idea that people in general, most people out there representatively are making this kind of beauty status exchange. It doesn't seem like they really are. And the positive correlations with beauty remain regardless of the status. This is not something that's in the chart, but it's something that's reported in the paper. And that means that when you control for status, the correlations for beauty remain, right? Even when you see couples that have mixed status in this data set, they still correlate the same for beauty. So it doesn't look like status is having a large effect on that. They seem to be things that are correlated within individuals, but not variables where one influences selection for the other in other partners, so to speak. Results here, going to put table 4 up on the screen for you. And here we're looking at between partner differences. Let me explain the concept here. If there is a beauty and status exchange, we should see that unattractive or low status individuals compensate by possessing more of the other traits, right? So say you're in a relationship with someone and you're not very attractive and they are moderately attractive, just to throw that out there. Because you are not very attractive, you need to have more status to be able to get that person, right? At least that is what we would expect if a beauty and status exchange is occurring. As in the last table, this would also appear as negative correlations. You can pause the video, you can look at the chart, there are no statistically significant negative correlations here. Not in the chart, but they ran this across many, many different subsamples, right? The older couples, the younger couples, different races and that sort of thing. Again, they found that there were no negative correlations across the subsamples that they ran, subsamples that they thought might be more likely to participate in a beauty status exchange. We don't see any negative socioeconomic status and attractiveness correlation. And actually, we see the reverse, right? Higher SES, higher beauty. So again, pretty strong evidence against the idea that there's much beauty status exchange going on here. Moving on to the next slide here, I'm going to put up as a slide some results from the regression and the difference measures. This was a series of regression models that they ran. Regression models, to explain, are the models they made intending to account for the potential effects of that within individual correlation, right? The things that the previous studies did not do that I mentioned in the background at the very beginning of the video. So regression models, when you account for all of these other variables across multiple models, they showed a small effect of education on beauty status exchange. Point 14, what does that mean? People exchange a little bit of education for attractiveness, or I should actually say it's the other way around. People exchange a little bit of attractiveness for education. People are willing to pick a partner who's a little bit less attractive if they are more educated. And there was no gender difference on this, guys. This was true for both men and women, surprisingly, because certainly many people have heard the narrative, right, that women value education more in men, and certainly there's a lot of evidence for that in the research that women do, in fact, value education more in men, and a more extreme narrative, right, that men don't care at all. Well, here we see, that education is actually a valuable trait for both men and women. It's an attractive trait for both men and women, and both men and women are perhaps able to give a little bit of wiggle room on attractiveness for more educated partners to the same extent. No gender difference. Small effect, so keep that in mind. It's not something huge to consider. Additionally, we're looking at here the difference measures, and the way that that is determined is they take the difference between male attractiveness and female attractiveness, and they use that to predict the difference between male status and female status. And this is going to be one of the big measures that would indicate a beauty status exchange. If there is a big predictive ability between that first difference and that second difference, we should see a correlation between those two differences, but we don't, right? There's no, you can see on the screen, no difference, right? It would have been a very compelling piece of evidence for the beauty status exchange, but it didn't come out at all. So pretty consistently up to this point in the results, what have we seen? Well, this beauty status exchange thing doesn't seem to really be manifesting itself in the data. Final bit of results here. These were just some other subgroups that they looked at in the data set. So, as mentioned, there was a small difference for dating couples in education. Remember, they looked at 500 couples who were dating, 500 couples who were living together, and 500 couples who were married, right? Dating couples valued education a little bit more than married couples did. Perhaps because they were a little bit younger on average, or perhaps because people are more selective about those kind of value traits when they're first picking a partner. Relationship was again small, but both men and women were willing to trade a little bit of attractiveness for a little bit of education. They looked at different racial backgrounds, no racial differences. They looked at the father's occupational background because we have seen in past research assortative mating for the occupational background of a father. They didn't find a relationship with that here. They did find a small difference for age gap couples. Again, related to education. Education is the only trade-off variable that manifested in this entire study. Perhaps, what they explain here is that could even just be an effect of younger people on average having less education. So it could be a relic of the correlation with age and not even an actual trade-off. Let's go ahead and summarize these results, and then let's kind of do a conclusion after that and repass over this paper. Beauty status exchange, as mentioned previously, didn't seem to come out much in this study. It was only evident for educational level, and it was a small effect. I've said a lot in the past about the importance of education. This was the one thing that kind of manifested. Education is probably the best thing that you can do, one of the few things that you can kind of change, in a moderate time period that actually kind of increases your mate value. Educational beauty status exchange. It was gender symmetric. What does that mean? No sex differences. People were willing to trade the same amount of attractiveness for beauty. So it wasn't hot women going after educated men. That's not what was seen here. Beauty status exchange declines more in committed relationships, mentioned previously in the slide. This, when it did manifest this effect at all, it was in the dating couple for education. In the married couples, it disappeared. So by the time people are married, by the time they're settled, they've probably already selected in a way that is very, very assortative. And seeking out more signals of status past that point, perhaps less important. So it's kind of normal that we might see that in younger dating couples. And again, it could also just be an effect of age as well. So why is that? When selecting a mate, as a young person, people look for prospective value. It's not always just what value does the person have at this moment. Research on mate selection and the mate switching theory or mate switching hypothesis, I should say, David Buss, he mentioned that people check for prospective mate value as well. Is someone going to be able to provide in the future? Are they going to go up in status eventually, or are they on the decline? Are they going to go down and down? And people think about those things before they, hitch their wagon to another person, so to speak. So all of that in mind, we can look at the discussion here. We can go over what the authors went over. At this point, these are the author's conclusions. I'm going to pass over what she said here and kind of summarize that for you. So, past research on the beauty exchange question probably overestimated it, right? It was probably due in large part, the effects found in previous research, to this individual correlation of beauty and status, that 0.1 to 0.2.5 correlation between things like income and physical attractiveness within individuals. You account for that and it pretty much goes entirely away. So, no real support for beauty status exchange in couples. Remember from the beginning, salience bias, right? You occasionally see a beauty status exchange. These results don't mean that it doesn't exist, right? This is a representative sample of the population, which means it's going to generalize to the population, and I could give you the actual number. From that number, it should generalize to the population, with a margin of error of about 3 to 4%. But there are still going to be people within that 3 to 4%, right, that fall outside of that. And what we're looking at here is outliers. So it's normal that you occasionally see a rich, hot couple. You can't point to an anecdote or an outlier and say, this outlier refutes the trend. It, of course, doesn't. That's not how statistics work. And something about outliers in samples, even when you have a very large representative sample, it can miss people that are members of very, very, very small populations, You have a country of 300 million people, for example, 360 million people in the United States, I believe. You take a sample of 2,000 people. Imagine there's a population, a subpopulation within that only has 20,000 people in it. Very easy to miss that entire 20,000 person population. You can take a representative sample of the United States, for example, using a real population here, and you might not have any Amish people in that sample. You give them a questionnaire, simple one-question questionnaire. Who here is Amish? Boom, 0 across the board. And so you conclude no Amish people exist in the United States. Well, Amish people exist. The problem is that even representative samples can miss small populations within a very, very large population. So that's probably what's going on here, is these beauty status exchange at any meaningful level is probably really, really rare. But it happens. The fact that it is rare, the fact that it happens, but it can't even show up on a representative survey, is actually a pretty big problem for sociobiological theories of mate selection. And that includes theories of mate selection within evolutionary psychology, many that I have talked to you about here before and explained. And particularly, this comes down to the idea, right, that women evolved to select and prefer mates who are resource providers, while women evolved to select mates that are beautiful, right? If we see that there's no actual selection for those traits, something is going on that has to explain that. If women aren't picking, good providers, and men aren't picking good women, something is preventing that. Either they really didn't evolve to prefer those things, which is unlikely because most research indicates that we did evolve with those preferences. And when you look at actual preferences versus mate selection, we can see that those preferences exist, right? Women will tell you that they want a high status, good provider, caretaker of the family kind of mate, and men will tell you they want a beautiful mate, and they'll both tell you as well that they want physically attractive mates. So there's probably something happening that prevents people from those aspirational desires, right? That forces people more into selection. But it still poses a problem for these theories. It's something that has to be reconciled. There's no alternate explanation in this paper. Something to think about, going forward in future research. Something else to consider that would bring this into question was that when we did see the beauty status exchange, it also wasn't bound by sex, right? It wasn't related to sex. That little bit of trade-off that we did see for education was something that men and women were willing to do. So that's something, by these sociobiological explanations, that we should expect from women, but not from men. And there's actually a lot more little things like that are coming to light, that men have preferences kind of similar to women in some things that don't match up with the evolutionary explanations for what men should prefer. Why is that? Why do they have that preference? We don't know. We can't say from this methodology if it's something innate in men that has to do with male biology, if it's evolved, if it is a recent preference, if it is even a preference that we learned that is conflicting with innate dispositions. You can't tell from this kind of methodology, but we can see kind of that the effect exists. Something to keep in mind about assortative selection. Assortative selection for socioeconomic status is also an assortative selection for culture, right? People who are poor and middle class, people who are extremely wealthy and middle class, a lot of the time they don't have a lot in common. They can be very, very different worlds. And people think about that when they select mates. People think about, if I select a mate who's from an entirely different class, wealthy people certainly think about this and have planned their mate selection very, very carefully around this. If I select a poor mate, is this going to harm me and my bloodline in the long run? Is this going to harm my family? Is this going to harm my dynasty? Am I going to struggle in life if I am the sole breadwinner as a middle class person and my wife makes no money? Those are questions that people ask that drive assortion for socioeconomic status. It's possible that only the most wealthy individuals can really make that kind of sacrifice because it's an exchange, it's a trade-off. And that's kind of the trophy wife, right? The real trophy wife thing, or even the real sugar daddy phenomenon, where if you are a very, very wealthy individual, you have money disposable to throw away, planes and jets, whatever. You can get a wife who is a literal gold digger model, and perhaps the relative cost to you won't be very much because you already have so much money. And that might be consistent with the stereotype that these highly wealthy men are picking very, very young women. That might be why we see that more, and why it didn't come out in this research, because it doesn't describe a behavior of the general population. It describes a behavior, again, of a very, very tiny community of select minorities, wealthy individuals. Remember that assortative mating is also influenced by opportunity. This is related to the previous point. People who come from very different social backgrounds simply may never meet, right? You work at a McDonald's, you're a woman, you're not going to meet Elon Musk. You're not going to be the mother of his 25th child or whatever. It's not going to happen because you're not in an environment with Elon Musk. If you want to meet Elon Musk and have his 35th baby, then you need to go and work at Tesla or wherever he is hanging out. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So that's what happens. People select mates mostly from in their environments. Even with online dating now, still, about 60% of relationships are not formed online. You got to be able to meet someone in your immediate environment, and that drives a lot of this assortative effect. A note about this study that they mentioned, age needs to be looked at. These couples were not that old, which may have excluded a tendency for very old individuals to select way, way down. It didn't have anyone over middle age. So we're looking, at young to before middle-aged couples here. We may still see, very, very rich men pick young, hot women. Personally, I don't think it's very common. I think it would, even that in that case, if you included that demographic, they would still be outliers, but it's not something that we would have detected, in this study with this methodology. Take-home points from this study. What are the big conclusions here? Very strong support for the matching hypothesis for assortative mating. Not a surprise because, it's one of the most well-supported observations in mate selection, assortative mating. More interestingly, perhaps more controversially, is that it kind of debunks the idea that a beauty status trade-off is a major thing in most relationships. Seems like most relationships are pretty well matched across all variables, socioeconomic status, attractiveness, education, the big ones, basically. People are picking people similar to them across all of those variables. Brief final thoughts here. I don't have a lot to say on this paper. I think it was kind of self-explanatory in what the implications are. But the first one, stay in school, right? Probably, that's something you should do even if you never want to date, ever. But consistently, education seems to be a predictor across research for mate value, right? Here we see the relationship was small. In past research, it was fairly large. I've mentioned studies in videos here where, for example, biographies on Tinder that mentioned a bachelor's degree or higher got 3 times more matches. So even in a very, very superficial environment like Tinder, like online dating, just seeing like, oh, so-and-so went to this school already gets the same profile, more matches. So, and this is something you can control. Of the many, many variables in mate selection that you can't control, this is perhaps one that is arguably more within your own control. And certainly there's a debate to be had around that point insofar as how much can you really control even your ability to go to school and finish. If you're not a very intelligent person, if you're not a very disciplined person, low conscientiousness, maybe you can't control that, and maybe realistically you could make an argument like, hey, I can't even control it. But let's say compared to something like height, perhaps it is more environmentally malleable. The other big take home here from research on assortative mating from this study is that physical attractiveness, as well as your personality, the attractiveness of your personality, will determine the kind of person that you are with. Your mates are people that are going to be like you. Something to consider for your relationships, if you have good relationships, if you have bad relationships. There's always a moment to reflect inward and think, why do I keep attracting this kind of person? Be they good or be they bad? And perhaps if you want to attract better partners, you can make yourself a better person. You can work on yourself. But even that, I say perhaps, and the reason is because just because we see that correlation, it doesn't even mean that you're necessarily going to be able to level up and then get a better partner from leveling up. You can't just replicate one variable in a correlation and assume that that's the case. So I wish I could give you, a motivational tidbit to leave you with at the end of this video. Like, yeah, guys, just level up, right? Because your partners are going to be like you. So if you make yourself really a great person, you're going to attract a really, really good partner. You might. But you might not. It might not even work that way. And we don't know from this research, and we really don't know from any of the research on this, because we've never really observed that kind of causal relationship as far as I know. These are correlations that are very consistently observed, that people select others similar to them across behavior, across personality, across attractiveness. But that doesn't mean that if you try to change your behavior or anything like that, you're going to get a better mate. In some things, I think intuitively, it is probably the case, right? Like, let's say you're obese. You lose the weight. You go to the gym, and now you're jacked. Are you more likely than you were as an obese person to get a fitness girlfriend? Almost certainly, right? Let's say you're very disagreeable, right? You score very, very low in trait agreeableness, which is a predictor of poor relationship outcomes. And you say, okay, I'm going to go to therapy and I'm going to try to raise my trait agreeableness. Well, first off, these personality traits, they're not very malleable, guys. Maybe you can raise it a little notch, But then raising it a little notch, is that going to guarantee that you get a more agreeable girlfriend? Less intuitive than the gym example. So, caveats here. Sometimes, guys, I don't bring good news. I just bring bad news. But I hope that you enjoyed the video anyway. And leave a comment, guys. Let me know what you thought. Like the video. I'll make another one for you guys very soon.